5 Apache widows knocked on his door and changed the rancher's life forever. John Miller had lived all his life on the edge of the Arizona desert. The land was wide and open, stretching endlessly under the bright blue sky, with dry hills and dusty trails that seemed to go on forever. The ranch he inherited from his father was not a large one, but it was enough to keep him busy. Every morning, John would wake before sunrise. The rooster's crow was his alarm clock, and the smell of fresh coffee and the cool morning air were his welcome to the day. His days were simple, yet hard. He fed the cattle before the sun touched the horizon, making sure each animal had enough to eat and clean water. Sometimes he would repair fences that had broken overnight from the wind or wandering animals. Other days, he worked on the old pickup truck that was more than 30 years old. It was rusty, worn, and sometimes refused to start, but John loved it because it had been his father's. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills, painting the sky with shades of red and orange. The desert was quiet, almost eerily so, but in that quiet John felt a deep sense of peace. Despite the solitude, there was something missing in John's life. He had friends in the nearby town, people he would greet at the grocery store or the gas station, but he had never been very close to anyone. Conversations usually ended politely, and then everyone returned to their own busy lives. Sometimes, on lonely nights, John would lie in bed listening to the wind rustle through the trees and feel a quiet ache in his heart, a longing for something he could not name. He loved the ranch, he loved the land, but he also wondered if there was more to life than work and silence. One afternoon, as John was fixing a gate near the corral, he heard the sound of soft footsteps on the gravel driveway. It was unusual to have visitors, and he looked up, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. At the edge of the driveway stood 5 women. They were not strangers in the way people pass by in town. They looked determined but gentle, their eyes calm yet carrying a quiet sadness. Their clothing was simple, traditional, and well-worn, showing that they had traveled a long way. John felt a mix of curiosity and caution. He had never seen these women before. They carried themselves with dignity, and there was something about them that made him pause. One of the women stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "We are widows from the Apache community nearby. We are in need of help and a safe place to stay for a little while. We hope you might allow us shelter." John blinked, surprised. He had heard stories of the Apache community, but he had never interacted with them personally. His first instinct was to say no. He had a routine, a life carefully measured by work and solitude. But as he looked into their eyes, he noticed the sincerity, the courage it must have taken to approach a stranger and ask for help. He felt something stir inside him, a mixture of empathy, curiosity, and a strange sense of responsibility. He stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. "Well, I don't usually have guests," he said, his voice rough from years of talking to animals more than people. "But come in. You can have some water and food." The women nodded gratefully and entered the small ranch house. The interior was humble, a wooden table in the center, a few chairs, a simple stove, and shelves lined with books, tools, and some family photos. John motioned for them to sit while he prepared a meal. He set down a pot of stew, bread, and fresh fruit on the table. The women accepted the food with quiet thanks, their expressions soft but alert, as if they were assessing the stranger who had opened his door. As they ate, they began to share pieces of their lives. One by one, they spoke about their husbands, the men they had lost, and the hardships they had faced. One woman, with silver streaks in her dark hair, spoke about raising her children alone after her husband passed unexpectedly. Another, younger and quiet, described the struggle of keeping her family traditions alive while navigating a world that often did not understand them. Their words were simple but carried great weight, stories of love, loss, and survival. John listened silently, sometimes nodding, sometimes just staring into the distance. He was struck by their strength. Here were women who had faced unimaginable challenges, yet they had walked into his life with courage and grace. He realized that they were not asking for charity. They were asking for a chance to be seen, to be respected, and to be safe for a while. After dinner, they sat together on the porch. The desert air was cool and the sky above was turning deep blue, dotted with stars. The women spoke of their community, their traditions, and their hopes. John felt a connection he had never felt before. It was as if, for the first time in years, his home was not just a place of solitude. It was a place of shared stories, of human presence. As night fell, John offered them blankets and set up a few mattresses on the floor for them to sleep on. They accepted, and before long, the house was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside. John lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about the day, the unexpected knock on his door, and the lives of the women who had entered his world. He realized that life could be unpredictable and that sometimes change came in ways that could not be planned or foreseen. For John, this was the beginning of something new. The ranch, which had been a place of work and solitude, was about to become a place of learning, connection, and transformation. He did not yet know how much these 5 women would change his life, but as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a small spark of hope, a feeling that perhaps his quiet world was about to open in ways he had never imagined. The next morning, John awoke to the sound of movement in the kitchen. The widows were already up, preparing breakfast with a quiet efficiency that amazed him. The aroma of coffee, bread, and cooked eggs filled the house. Watching them work together, he realized that life could be shared, and even the simplest routines could become meaningful when people came together with respect and care. That day, John and the women worked on small tasks around the ranch. They fixed a broken fence, cleaned the barn, and even tended to the garden. While doing so, they laughed, exchanged stories, and taught each other skills. John discovered that these women were more than survivors. They were teachers, leaders, and friends. Every task became a lesson, every conversation a bridge to understanding, and slowly a bond began to form. By evening, John stood on his porch again, looking at the desert stretching into the horizon. The ranch no longer felt empty. It felt alive, filled with possibility and promise. He thought about the unusual knock on his door the day before and realized that life sometimes gave second chances in the most unexpected ways. These 5 women, coming from lives so different from his own, had entered his world and, without knowing it, had begun to change him forever. John knew that challenges lay ahead, living together, understanding each other's customs, and navigating the differences between their worlds would not always be easy. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face those challenges. He had opened his door and his heart, and already life felt richer, fuller, and more meaningful. John Miller felt a quiet unease as he watched the 5 women move about his small ranch. It was one thing to offer them shelter for a night, but now that they were staying, a new sense of responsibility settled on him. He wasn't sure how to act or what was expected of him, but he knew one thing clearly: he could not turn them away. There was something about their presence that stirred feelings he had long forgotten: empathy, curiosity, and an unusual sense of purpose. The morning began as it always did, with John feeding the cattle while the women prepared breakfast. Yet today was different. There was a rhythm to their actions that was comforting, almost like a dance they had practiced over many years. One of the older widows, named Mary, approached him while he was fixing a gate. "John," she said softly, "you work very hard, but you must also take care of yourself. You cannot do everything alone." John looked up, surprised by her gentle honesty. He had spent years learning to rely only on himself. "I'm fine," he replied, shrugging. "This is how I've always done it." Mary smiled but did not argue. She had learned that some lessons could not be forced. Instead, she nodded and returned to the house, leaving John to think about her words. For the first time, he realized that he had been living in a kind of isolation, not just physically but emotionally as well. Life on the ranch had taught him independence, but it had not taught him the value of connection, of trusting others, or of sharing burdens. As the days passed, the women began to settle in. They organized the small house, making it feel more like home. They washed clothes, tended to the garden, and even prepared traditional meals using fresh ingredients from the land. The smells of roasting vegetables and warm bread filled the kitchen, creating an atmosphere of comfort and life. John noticed how their presence changed even the simplest routines. Tasks that had once felt lonely or tedious were now shared experiences, filled with laughter, conversation, and sometimes gentle teasing. One afternoon, as John was mending a fence with the help of Sarah, a younger widow, he asked her about life in their community. Sarah spoke with a soft but steady voice, sharing stories about the traditions and customs of the Apache people. She described ceremonies, dances, and rituals that honored their ancestors, the land, and the spirits around them. John listened with fascination. He had never experienced anything like this, and he realized how little he knew about the world beyond his ranch. "Why do you keep these traditions alive?" he asked, genuinely curious. Sarah looked at him, her eyes reflecting pride and determination. "Because they are part of who we are," she said. "They connect us to our past, to our family, and to the land. They remind us that even in hardship, we are never alone." John paused, thinking about his own life. He had spent years working the land, but he had never considered it as more than a job. The women's words made him see the ranch differently. The hills, the soil, the river, they were not just obstacles to be managed or resources to be used. They were alive, sacred in their own way and deserving of respect. The evenings became a time of storytelling. Around the small fireplace, the women would share memories of their husbands, their families, and the struggles they had endured. Each story was different, yet connected by a common thread of resilience and hope. John would listen, sometimes interjecting with questions, sometimes sitting quietly, absorbing the lessons in silence. He discovered that stories were more than entertainment. They were a way to understand life, to pass down knowledge, and to build empathy. One evening, Mary shared a story that struck John deeply. She spoke of her husband, a kind and hardworking man who had died suddenly from illness. She described the early days of grief, how she had felt lost and afraid, and how she had learned to find strength in herself and her community. As she spoke, John noticed tears welling in his eyes. He had never allowed himself to feel grief so openly. He had always pushed it aside, thinking it a weakness. But hearing her story made him realize that vulnerability could be a form of courage, and that sharing pain could create connection instead of loneliness. The women also taught John practical skills. They showed him how to cook traditional dishes, how to sew and mend clothing, and how to gather herbs and plants for natural remedies. John, in return, taught them about ranch work, how to feed cattle, mend fences, and ride horses safely. There were moments of frustration, as the learning process was not always smooth. Tools were misused, instructions were misunderstood, and tensions occasionally flared. But each mistake was met with patience and laughter, turning small failures into opportunities for learning and bonding. One day, a sudden storm hit the ranch. The sky darkened, winds howled, and rain fell in sheets. John hurried to secure the animals, but the women were already outside helping. Together, they worked to protect the cattle, cover the garden, and secure the old barn. By the time the storm passed, everyone was soaked and exhausted, but there was a deep sense of accomplishment and camaraderie. John realized that they were no longer just guests. They were part of a team, a family in the making. As trust grew, so did emotional openness. The women shared their fears, their hopes, and their regrets. John, who had once been reserved and cautious, began to open up about his own past. He spoke of his father, who had raised him alone after his mother passed when he was a child, of the loneliness he had felt growing up, and of the dreams he had set aside in favor of survival and routine. The women listened without judgment, offering encouragement and understanding. John felt a sense of relief, as if a weight he had carried for years was beginning to lift. One afternoon, while sitting by the small garden they had planted together, Sarah asked John a question that stayed with him for days. "What do you want your life to be, John? Not just the ranch, but your heart, your family, your story." He did not answer immediately. He had never asked himself that question so directly. For years, he had focused on survival, on routine, and on keeping the ranch functioning. He had not considered what he truly wanted from life, or how he wanted to live beyond the daily grind. The question lingered in his mind, prompting reflection and quiet dreaming. The bond between John and the women deepened as weeks turned into months. They celebrated small victories, fixing a broken fence, harvesting vegetables, or successfully tending to a sick calf. They also faced challenges together, from equipment breaking down to harsh weather conditions. Each obstacle was met with collaboration, patience, and shared effort. John noticed that he was laughing more, thinking more creatively, and feeling more alive than he had in years. Through the women, John began to learn the power of perspective. They taught him to see beauty in the smallest things: a bird nesting in the barn, the patterns of rain on the desert, the taste of fresh herbs in a meal. He learned patience, empathy, and the value of slowing down to notice the world around him. He also began to understand that life was not meant to be endured alone, but shared with those who could bring out the best in him. Evenings on the ranch became a mix of work, conversation, and reflection. They would sit together on the porch, sharing tea, watching the sunset, and speaking about hopes for the future. John realized that he had been living in isolation not because he wanted to, but because he did not know how to invite others into his life. Now he saw the beauty of trust, the importance of human connection, and the transformative power of sharing life's burdens and joys with others. By the end of the second month, John's life had begun to change in ways he could not have imagined. The ranch felt alive with laughter, stories, and the gentle hum of activity. The women were no longer visitors. They had become companions, teachers, and friends. John, once a solitary man, now found comfort in their presence, guidance in their wisdom, and inspiration in their resilience. He realized that his world, which had seemed complete in its simplicity, had expanded. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a space of learning, connection, and growth. Life had given him a gift in the form of these 5 widows, not just their presence, but their courage, knowledge, and willingness to share their lives. John understood that the journey ahead would not always be easy. There would be misunderstandings, moments of doubt, and challenges that tested patience and resolve. Yet, he felt ready to face them, strengthened by the lessons he was learning and the bonds that were forming. The women had taught him that true trust and friendship were built over time, through shared experience, respect, and openness. By the time the sun set each evening, John often found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The ranch that had once been a symbol of isolation and routine was now a place of warmth, laughter, and life. He realized that the women had not just changed his days, they had changed his heart. And he knew, with quiet certainty, that the transformation had only just begun. Life on the ranch was slowly transforming, and John Miller began to see the world in ways he had never imagined. The women, Mary, Sarah, and the others, brought with them not only their presence but a wealth of knowledge, tradition, and perspective. Every day became a learning experience, filled with lessons that extended far beyond the work of the ranch. For John, it was as if the walls he had built around his heart were starting to crumble, replaced by understanding, curiosity, and a quiet appreciation for life's deeper meaning. The mornings were still busy, with chores and tasks to maintain the ranch. John had taught the women how to handle the cattle, mend fences, and repair tools. But now, he found that they were teaching him as much as he was teaching them. Mary showed him how to recognize signs of weather changes by observing the clouds and the wind, skills that his father had never bothered to teach him. Sarah taught him how to cook traditional Apache dishes using simple ingredients, explaining the history and significance behind each recipe. Even the youngest widow, Clara, introduced John to the use of herbs and plants for remedies, something that amazed him with its practicality and connection to the land. At first, John felt awkward about learning from them. He had been proud of his self-reliance and independence, and the thought of taking guidance from others made him uncomfortable. But as the days passed, he realized that these lessons were not about weakness, they were about wisdom. The women were patient teachers, never scolding, never insisting, but always showing through action and explanation. Gradually, John began to embrace their guidance, noticing how their knowledge complemented his own skills rather than replacing them. It was not just practical knowledge they shared. The women also introduced John to the deeper meanings behind their traditions. One evening, they gathered around a small fire in the yard. Mary spoke about the importance of ceremonies that honored the ancestors, explaining how these rituals connected them to the past and to the spirits of the land. Sarah described how dances and songs carried stories of courage, resilience, and community. John listened intently, feeling a sense of reverence he had never known before. For the first time, he understood that the land he had worked all his life was more than property. It was sacred, alive, and deserving of respect. Over time, John began to participate in these traditions. At first, it was small gestures, helping prepare ceremonial meals or listening carefully to stories. Then, he took part in dances, initially feeling awkward but gradually finding rhythm and meaning in the movements. Each experience deepened his connection not only to the women, but also to the land, the community, and himself. He began to feel a sense of belonging that he had never experienced, a feeling that life was richer and fuller when shared with others. One day, as they worked together in the garden, Sarah asked John to help her plant a small patch of medicinal herbs. "These plants," she explained, "have been used by our people for generations. They heal the body, but they also heal the spirit. Caring for them is a way to care for yourself and your community." John nodded, carefully placing each seed in the soil, feeling a sense of connection to something larger than himself. The act of planting became symbolic, a reminder that growth required patience, care, and attention. The women also encouraged John to explore his own feelings and thoughts. They asked questions that made him reflect deeply. What did he truly value? What did he hope to leave behind? How did he want to live the rest of his life? These questions were sometimes uncomfortable, forcing John to confront emotions he had long suppressed: grief over his parents, regrets over missed opportunities, and fears about the future. Yet he found that sharing these feelings with the women brought relief and clarity. They listened without judgment, offering support, wisdom, and gentle guidance. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the edge of the property, John paused to watch the women work in the garden. He observed how they moved with purpose, care, and harmony. Even when tasks were difficult, they approached each challenge with patience and resilience. John realized that he had much to learn from them, not only about practical skills or traditions, but about life itself. Their strength was quiet but undeniable, and their ability to face hardship with dignity inspired him deeply. The ranch itself began to change as well. The once empty rooms of John's house were now filled with warmth, laughter, and the smells of home-cooked meals. The garden bloomed with vegetables, herbs, and flowers, cared for by hands that nurtured both the plants and each other. The animals, too, seemed to sense the shift in energy. The cattle were calmer, the horses more cooperative, and even the barn cats seemed to relax in the presence of the women. John realized that life on the ranch was no longer just about work. It was about creating a space where all living things could thrive. One evening, as they sat around the fire after a long day, Mary shared a story that lingered in John's mind. She spoke of her husband, who had faced danger and uncertainty during his life, but had always maintained courage and integrity. She described how loss and hardship had shaped her, teaching her resilience and compassion. John listened quietly, feeling a deep respect for her strength and wisdom. He thought about his own life, the losses he had endured, and the walls he had built around his heart. He realized that the women were teaching him not just skills or traditions, but how to live fully and meaningfully. As weeks turned into months, John noticed subtle changes in himself. He laughed more freely, expressed his thoughts more openly, and approached challenges with creativity and patience. The lessons he learned from the women extended beyond the ranch into his own understanding of community, empathy, and connection. He began to see the value in asking for help, in trusting others, and in embracing vulnerability. Each day brought a new insight, a new skill, or a new story that enriched his life and deepened his gratitude for the unexpected turn his life had taken. The women, in turn, grew more comfortable in the rhythm of ranch life. They adapted to the physical demands of the work, learned to ride horses, and even assisted in medical care for injured animals. But more importantly, they shared their own wisdom and traditions freely, creating a sense of mutual respect and collaboration. John realized that he had underestimated them at first, assuming that their experiences would be limited to hardship and domestic skills. In reality, they brought strength, intelligence, and insight that expanded his understanding of the world. One day, a neighbor visited the ranch, curious about the unusual household. He had heard stories of the 5 widows living with a solitary rancher and wanted to see for himself. John welcomed him cautiously, but as the neighbor observed the women working together, tending the animals, and engaging with John in conversation, he was impressed by the harmony and mutual respect that filled the ranch. John felt a quiet pride, recognizing that the women had transformed not only his life, but also the way others saw him and his home. Through shared meals, chores, and quiet evenings by the fire, John and the women discovered that life was richer when it was lived together. They celebrated small victories: the first vegetables harvested from the garden, a calf successfully born, or a repaired fence that withstood a storm. They faced challenges together, weathering storms, equipment failures, and the harsh realities of desert life with patience, courage, and teamwork. Each experience strengthened the bonds between them, creating a sense of family that John had never known he needed. By the end of the season, John reflected on how much he had grown. He had learned to appreciate the value of tradition, community, and shared experience. He had discovered that strength was not always physical. It could be emotional, spiritual, and deeply rooted in resilience and connection. The women had taught him to see the world differently, to honor life's lessons, and to embrace the unexpected. For John, the ranch was no longer just a place of work. It had become a place of learning, growth, and transformation. The women had not only enriched his daily life, but had also opened his heart to possibilities he had never imagined. He knew that challenges still lay ahead, but he felt ready to face them, guided by the wisdom, courage, and compassion of the 5 women who had knocked on his door. The bond between John and the women continued to deepen. They shared stories, worked side by side, and celebrated life's small joys together. John realized that the ranch was more than land and livestock. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a place where lives could intersect, heal, and grow. He had begun to understand that true happiness came not from isolation or routine, but from connection, trust, and the willingness to open one's heart to others. As the sun set over the desert each evening, John often stood on his porch, reflecting on the journey he had begun. He had come to understand that life's greatest lessons sometimes arrive unexpectedly, in the form of people who challenge, teach, and inspire us. The 5 women had changed his life, showing him that courage, wisdom, and love could come from the most surprising places. And so, life on the ranch continued, filled with learning, laughter, and quiet reflection. John knew that this chapter of his life was only the beginning. With the women by his side, he felt a sense of hope, purpose, and belonging that he had never known before. Together, they had begun to create something extraordinary, not just a home, but a life filled with meaning, connection, and transformation. Life on the ranch had entered a new rhythm. John Miller no longer felt the sharp edges of loneliness that had once defined his days. The presence of the 5 women brought warmth, laughter, and a sense of purpose that transformed the entire environment. Tasks that had once seemed mundane now held deeper meaning, and the ranch itself began to reflect the care, love, and effort they all invested. Each day became a mix of work, learning, and small celebrations of life's progress. The mornings often began with shared meals. The women would prepare breakfast together, combining ingredients from the garden with traditional recipes passed down through generations. The smells of freshly baked bread, roasted vegetables, and simmering stews filled the house, creating a comforting atmosphere. John found himself lingering at the table, listening to the stories, asking questions, and appreciating the flavors he had never encountered before. The meals became more than nourishment. They were moments of connection, where laughter mixed with conversation, and work for the day was planned collectively. After breakfast, the group would divide tasks. John and a few of the women tended to the cattle, mending fences, repairing barns, and ensuring that the animals were healthy and safe. The other women worked in the garden, planting vegetables, caring for the herbs, and teaching John how to prepare natural remedies from the plants. At first, John had been skeptical about some of the herbal treatments, but over time, he observed their effectiveness and learned to appreciate the wisdom behind them. Each task, whether physical or simple, became an opportunity to teach, learn, and grow together. The ranch itself began to change visibly. The garden flourished under the care of the women, with rows of vegetables and herbs growing stronger each week. Flowers bloomed near the windows, adding color and life to the house. The barns and fences, once weathered and worn, were repaired and reinforced. Even the cattle seemed healthier and more content, reflecting the calm and nurturing environment. Visitors who came to the ranch began to notice the difference, commenting on the harmony and order that seemed to radiate from the property. One day, John suggested that they invite neighbors from the surrounding area to visit and share in the harvest. The women agreed, and together they prepared for the gathering. They baked bread, prepared meals, and set up seating areas in the yard. When the neighbors arrived, they were greeted warmly, invited to share food, and encouraged to join in the activities. At first, some of the visitors were cautious, unsure how to interact with the group. But as the day progressed, laughter and conversation flowed freely. The women shared stories about their traditions, their experiences, and the lessons they had learned. John noticed how his neighbors' perceptions of him and his ranch were shifting. They now saw a place of warmth, community, and collaboration, rather than isolation. Through these gatherings, John began to understand the importance of community. He had spent years focused on his own routines and responsibilities, but he realized that life was richer when shared with others. The women had taught him not only practical skills, but also how to build trust, foster relationships, and create an environment where everyone felt welcome. John felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude for their guidance and presence. The transformation was not limited to physical improvements or social gatherings. Emotionally, John began to experience growth and healing. The women encouraged him to express his feelings openly, to share both joys and sorrows. They reminded him that vulnerability was not a weakness but a form of strength. John began to open up about the regrets and fears he had carried for years, missed opportunities, lost friendships, and the deep ache of loneliness. Sharing these emotions brought relief, and he noticed a lightness he had not felt in decades. Similarly, the women shared their own experiences and emotions. They spoke of loss, grief, hope, and resilience. Listening to their stories, John gained a deeper understanding of the human spirit, the capacity to endure hardship, to find strength in community, and to grow through adversity. He realized that their presence was a gift, not only because of what they contributed to the ranch, but because of the lessons they imparted about life, courage, and love. As the seasons changed, the ranch continued to thrive. In the summer, the garden overflowed with produce, and the women taught John how to preserve food for the colder months. They worked together to repair barns before storms arrived, and ensured that the animals were healthy and protected. Even small tasks, like collecting eggs or tending to the garden, were filled with shared laughter and meaningful conversation. John began to notice that the ranch was no longer just a property. It had become a living, breathing community. The bond between John and the women deepened further when challenges arose. One morning, a calf became sick, and John and the women worked tirelessly to nurse it back to health. They consulted books, shared knowledge of traditional remedies, and monitored the animal day and night. Their dedication paid off, and the calf recovered. John realized that this experience was more than animal care. It was a lesson in teamwork, empathy, and the power of persistence. He felt a growing respect and admiration for the women, recognizing their strength and determination in every action. John also began to understand the importance of cultural exchange. The women shared their traditions, stories, and rituals, while John introduced them to aspects of ranch life they had never known. Through these exchanges, they developed mutual respect and appreciation. John discovered that life's richness came not from routine or isolation, but from embracing diversity, learning from others, and valuing the wisdom of different experiences. One afternoon, as they sat under a large mesquite tree, the women taught John about the spiritual connection between people and the land. They explained that the desert, the hills, and the river were alive, and that caring for the land was a form of honoring life itself. John listened carefully, feeling a deep resonance with their words. He had always worked the land for survival, but now he understood its sacredness and his role as a caretaker, not just an owner. The ranch began to attract more visitors, not for curiosity alone, but because people recognized the harmony and respect that radiated from the home. John and the women welcomed everyone with openness, offering meals, guidance, and stories. These interactions reinforced the sense of community and purpose that had grown on the ranch. John saw how the women had not only changed his life, but also the lives of those around him, spreading lessons of empathy, cooperation, and mutual respect. Despite the progress, life on the ranch was not without difficulties. Harsh weather, mechanical failures, and physical exhaustion tested their endurance. Yet, every challenge became an opportunity for collaboration. John noticed how the women's resilience inspired him to persevere. Together, they faced problems with patience, creativity, and determination. Each success, no matter how small, strengthened their bonds and reaffirmed the value of working together. John began to reflect on how much his perspective had shifted. He had once believed that his life was complete in solitude, that the ranch and its tasks were enough to sustain him. But now he saw that true fulfillment came from relationships, shared experiences, and the courage to open one's heart to others. The women had taught him that life's richness was not in possessions or routine, but in connection, compassion, and the willingness to grow. Even the evenings were filled with learning and reflection. Around the fire, they would share stories, songs, and lessons from both Apache tradition and ranch life. John found himself eager to listen, to ask questions, and to absorb the wisdom being shared. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the women's presence, realizing that their arrival at his door had sparked a transformation that went far beyond the physical improvements to the ranch. By the end of the season, the ranch was no longer a solitary refuge. It had become a place of life, learning, and community. John and the women had created an environment where work, tradition, and human connection intertwined seamlessly. They had built something far greater than any fence, barn, or garden. They had built a home where hearts and minds could flourish. John often paused on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the hills. The ranch that had once felt lonely and static now pulsed with life, warmth, and purpose. He thought about the 5 widows who had knocked on his door, realizing that they had not only changed his daily life, but had also reshaped his understanding of the world. Their courage, wisdom, and resilience had become a guiding force in his life, inspiring him to be more open, patient, and compassionate. As the sky turned golden and the stars appeared, John understood something important. Life was no longer just about surviving or maintaining routines. It was about learning, sharing, and growing together. The women had shown him that true transformation comes from connection, and that unexpected encounters can bring the greatest blessings. The ranch was no longer just land and animals. It was a living testament to the power of human kindness, courage, and collaboration. Through shared meals, hard work, and heartfelt conversations, John realized that he had not only gained companions, but had also discovered a new way of living. The ranch had become a place of hope, community, and inspiration, a place where lessons were learned, bonds were strengthened, and hearts were opened. And as he looked at the 5 women working quietly in the fading light, John knew that his life had been changed forever, in ways he had never anticipated. Life on the ranch had fully transformed. What had once been a quiet, lonely place for John Miller was now a home alive with laughter, learning, and connection. The 5 women, Mary, Sarah, Clara, and the others, had become far more than visitors. They were family, friends, teachers, and companions. Each day was filled with purpose, each task a shared experience, and every evening brought reflection, gratitude, and quiet joy. John often found himself pausing in the middle of chores to observe the women at work. He saw the way Mary carefully tended the garden, teaching the younger women how to plant, prune, and care for vegetables and herbs. He noticed the way Sarah baked bread, humming softly as she kneaded the dough, and how Clara used plants to make simple remedies for minor aches and colds. Every action, no matter how small, seemed purposeful and meaningful. John realized that the women's presence had created a rhythm, a flow to daily life that brought harmony and joy. The seasons changed, and with each one came new challenges and opportunities. In the spring, they planted new crops, repaired barns, and cared for newborn calves. Summer brought long, hot days, but the work was tempered with laughter and shared stories. In the autumn, the garden produced an abundance of fruits, vegetables, and herbs, which they harvested and preserved for the colder months. Winter tested their endurance, as storms brought cold winds and heavy rains, but they faced every challenge together. John marveled at how life on the ranch had become a shared journey, full of learning, growth, and resilience. One day, John realized that he had changed in ways he never anticipated. He had become more patient, more empathetic, and more willing to open his heart to others. He thought back to the day the 5 widows had knocked on his door, and understood that their arrival had been nothing short of miraculous. They had entered his life quietly, with humility and courage, and had begun a transformation that extended far beyond daily chores or practical skills. They had taught him about life, love, and the importance of human connection. The women, too, had changed. They had grown stronger, more confident, and more connected to the land. The ranch, once foreign and demanding, had become a place of security, purpose, and collaboration. They had brought their traditions, knowledge, and resilience into John's world and had blended it with the rhythms of ranch life. Together, they had created something extraordinary, a home that was both practical and sacred, a space of learning, healing, and belonging. Community began to take notice of the changes on the ranch. Neighbors who had once viewed John as a solitary figure now saw a thriving, welcoming environment. Visitors came not only to witness the transformation but to participate in it. They learned from the women's wisdom, helped with the garden, and shared meals. John noticed how the presence of the women had extended beyond the ranch, influencing those around them and spreading lessons of kindness, cooperation, and resilience. John reflected on the lessons he had learned from the women. He realized that true strength was not measured by independence alone, but by the ability to collaborate, to share burdens, and to open oneself to growth. He had learned that love and friendship were active, not passive. They required attention, care, and mutual respect. Most importantly, he understood that life's richest experiences came from connection, from seeing others fully, and from being seen in return. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John sat on the porch with the women gathered around him. They shared tea, laughter, and stories from both their pasts and the present. Mary spoke of her late husband, sharing memories that were filled with love, sorrow, and wisdom. Sarah recounted the history of their community, teaching John about resilience, courage, and the value of maintaining one's identity even in difficult circumstances. Clara spoke softly about the small lessons of life, the importance of observing the world, and finding joy in simple acts of care. John listened, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. He had learned to appreciate the depth and value of shared experiences, to understand the balance between giving and receiving, and to recognize the ways in which life could be enriched by openness and trust. The women had changed not only the rhythm of his days, but the very way he approached the world. There were still challenges, of course. Weather continued to test their resilience, and occasional disagreements reminded them that living together required patience and understanding. But John noticed that conflicts were no longer sources of frustration. They were opportunities for communication, compromise, and growth. The women had taught him that relationships required effort and intention, and he had come to value the beauty in shared problem-solving and collaborative decision-making. The ranch became a place of learning for John, the women, and anyone who visited. The women taught traditional skills, cultural practices, and life lessons that were as practical as they were meaningful. John shared his knowledge of ranching, animal care, and land management. Together, they discovered that teaching and learning were acts of love, and that every shared skill strengthened the bonds between them. The ranch became a living classroom, where lessons of resilience, cooperation, and respect were passed from one generation to the next. John also began to notice changes within himself that went beyond skills or knowledge. He became more reflective, taking time to observe the land, the animals, and the people around him. He noticed the way the wind moved through the trees, how the river shimmered under the sun, and the small signs of life that often went unnoticed. The women had taught him to slow down, to appreciate these moments, and to find meaning in both work and quiet reflection. As the years passed, the bond between John and the women deepened into something enduring. They celebrated milestones together, the birth of a new calf, the harvest of the garden, and even birthdays and personal achievements. John realized that his life, once defined by solitude, had transformed into a shared journey filled with purpose, love, and community. The women had brought richness, diversity, and wisdom into his world, showing him that life's greatest gifts often arrive unexpectedly. One day, John looked out over the ranch, the sun casting golden light across the hills, and felt a profound sense of peace. The ranch was thriving, The animals were healthy, and the women moved about with confidence and grace. He reflected on the journey they had taken together, from the first hesitant knock on his door to the fully integrated, vibrant life they now shared. Every challenge they had faced, every lesson they had learned, and every moment of joy had shaped a life that was far richer than he had ever imagined. John also recognized the lasting impact the women had on the community. Their presence had fostered cooperation, understanding, and mutual respect. Neighbors who once kept their distance now visited with curiosity and openness, eager to learn from their knowledge and experience. John realized that the women's influence extended far beyond the ranch. They were teachers, leaders, and examples of resilience and courage for everyone who encountered them. Through all of this, John understood the most important lesson of all. Life's greatest transformations often come from unexpected encounters. The 5 widows who had arrived at his door had brought more than help, stories, or tradition. They had brought a new way of seeing the world, a new way of relating to others, and a deeper understanding of himself. They had shown him that connection, trust, and shared purpose were at the heart of a meaningful life. Even the small moments were significant. The laughter shared over a spilled basket of vegetables, the quiet conversations under the stars, the collective effort of tending the land, all became part of the rhythm of life that John cherished. He realized that these moments, ordinary on their own, were extraordinary when shared with people who cared deeply, taught patiently, and lived with integrity. As the years continued, the ranch became a symbol of hope, resilience, and transformation. John and the women had built more than a home. They had built a life. It was a life where human connection mattered, where lessons were shared, where laughter and stories filled the air, and where every day offered the possibility of growth and learning. John understood that this transformation was ongoing, a journey without end, but he faced it with gratitude, courage, and an open heart. At night, when John finally lay down to rest, he often reflected on the day. He thought about the challenges they had overcome, the successes they had celebrated, and the ways they had all grown together. He knew that he had been profoundly changed, not just as a rancher or a man, but as a person capable of love, trust, and deep connection. The 5 widows had brought wisdom, resilience, and compassion into his life, showing him that life's greatest gifts often arrive in the most unexpected ways. John understood with quiet certainty that his life would never be the same. The ranch, once a solitary refuge, had become a place of learning, community, and joy. The women had not only changed his daily life, but had reshaped the very way he experienced the world. Together, they had created a legacy of connection, growth, and hope that would endure long after any single season or challenge. And so, as the stars appeared over the desert sky, John felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had discovered the power of human connection, the beauty of shared purpose, and the importance of opening one's heart to life's unexpected blessings. The 5 widows who had knocked on his door had not just changed the ranch, they had changed him forever, leaving an imprint on his soul that would last a lifetime.